Okay, welcome everyone. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here for this explainer. Today, we're setting off on a really fascinating and heavily logic-driven journey into the natural world. But we're looking at it through a very specific and honestly kind of unsettling lens. We're going to explore exactly how extreme environmental disruptors, stuff like radiation, massive nuclear disasters, and even some seriously potent natural toxins, drastically alter animal biology. We'll be using the data, the historical records, and the cold, hard biological evidence presented right here to uncover the invisible forces that literally reshape life at a genetic level. So let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this with a bit of a weird question. What do a six-legged frog, a completely chaotic spiderweb, and SpongeBob SquarePants have in common? I mean, on the surface, absolutely nothing, right? One's a biological anomaly, one's a weird behavioral glitch, and the last is, well, a beloved cartoon character. But, as you'll see by the end of this explainer, these bizarre, seemingly totally unrelated case studies are actually all intimately tied to the exact same history of environmental and genetic disruption. Section 1. The physical cost of radiation, focusing on frogs and rats. So following the worst nuclear reactor accident in history over in Ukraine back in 1986, researchers surveying the local area around Chernobyl made some pretty shocking discoveries. They found these frogs that looked completely normal, until you actually counted their legs. Some had extra limbs, and some even grew up to 6 legs all at once. And what's even more disturbing is where these extra legs were showing up. They were growing out of the frogs' abdomens or even their tails. It's a profound and honestly tragic irony. Human activity, a massive failure of human engineering, ended up completely wrecking these untouched animal ecosystems. And because of these extra misplaced limbs, these poor frogs struggled immensely to just move properly, making it practically impossible for them to survive out in the wild. Let's move to and see how this builds. We need to look at the exact biological mechanism of this mutation. Like, how does one leg suddenly turn into multiple? Well, it happens right at the very beginning of life. Step 1, the frog egg is just starting to develop into an embryo. But then step 2 hits. Radiation in the environment physically damages that embryo's developing DNA. Because of that damage, we hit step 3, where the body's natural growth signals are just completely disrupted. The biological blueprint gets totally scrambled. Which leads us to step 4. Cells that were supposed to just form a single normal leg decide to divide abnormally, creating these completely unneeded additional limbs. But, it wasn't just the frogs suffering from these extreme physical alterations. Let's talk about the rats living around Chernobyl. Now, radiation is known to damage the specific genes responsible for developing hard tissues, like bones and teeth. And here's the thing about rodents. Their teeth naturally continue growing forever. They manage that by constantly gnawing on things. But because the radiation severely damaged their jaw structure, the actual direction of that tooth growth became completely abnormal. Scientists actually called this an overgrowth mutation. These endlessly growing teeth literally curved backward toward the face, and in some cases, pierced right through the inside of the animal's mouth. This specific horrific jaw damage made basic stuff like eating and just staying alive virtually impossible for them. It perfectly bridges the gap between microscopic genetic damage and the harsh, practical reality of survival. Section 2. Bikini Bottom's dark reality, looking at the cartoon versus history. We all know the cartoon reality, right? SpongeBob SquarePants and his quirky fish neighbors living happily in a pineapple under the sea in Bikini Bottom. But there is a surprisingly dark historical reality here. That iconic cartoon setting was actually inspired by a very real-world nuclear testing site known as Bikini Atoll. And a lot of those strange, funny fish designs you see in the show, they were actually inspired by real fish affected by radioactive exposure in that specific area. During the embryonic stage, that radiation exposure caused fish to be born with curved bodies, abnormal jaws, extreme bone deformities, and damaged skin. Some couldn't even swim properly. It is fascinating and, yeah, definitely a bit unsettling to realize that a cartoon most of us just see as a funny show actually contains a super subtle reference to the devastating effects of human nuclear activity on marine ecosystems. Section 3. Mind and Behavior Mutations. The Invisible Damage. And this brilliantly illustrates the historical timeline of the various disasters and experiments we're covering today, stretching from intentional tests to completely accidental disasters. From the 1940s through the 60s, we had the biological weapons race utilizing insects. Then, hopping into the 1970s, there were intentional nervous system experiments on spiders. And finally, the catastrophic accidental disasters, Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima Daiichi in 2011. So, Let's look at that first era. Right at the height of the Cold War, major countries, specifically the US and the Soviet Union, were aggressively competing to develop effective biological weapons. They blasted massive doses of gamma and X-rays at insects to see how radiation could alter the DNA of living organisms, like flies, beetles, and moths. And honestly, it did work to an extent. The radiation caused these insects to develop wildly abnormal body growth, deformed wings, and they grew far, far larger than normal. But here's the catch. Because the radiation damaged the very genes that regulate body development, the growth process became totally unstable. These experiments ultimately failed because the giant insects simply couldn't survive for long periods of time. So the whole biological weapons project, scientifically useless in the end. By the late 1970s, though, scientists changed their whole approach. They exposed spiders to radiation and chemicals, but this time not to mutate their bodies. They wanted to study the nervous system. The spiders themselves lived normally, without any visible physical bodily damage. But check this out. A normal spider creates a web that is beautifully symmetrical and neatly organized, right? The radiated spiders, however, produced webs that were just completely chaotic, highly asymmetrical, and sometimes they just left them entirely unfinished. The radiation hadn't changed their physical form at all. Instead, it fundamentally disrupted their brain function and their movement coordination. Their natural built-in ability to create precise patterns just broke down. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful quote that perfectly summarizes those spider experiments. Radiation does not always change the physical form of living creatures. It can also alter behavior and brain function. This right here is a massive turning point in our explainer. We so often look for the obvious stuff, right? The six-legged frogs or the giant bugs. But this proves that invisible neurological damage can be just as profound and just as destructive to an animal's entire way of life. Moving into Section 4, Inherited Scars and Colors, looking at generational trauma. 640. That is the high-end estimate of human cancer-related deaths linked to radiation exposure from the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. Now, while the disaster didn't directly cause immediate deaths right at the time of the explosion, the delayed radiation exposure claimed an estimated 130 to 640 lives later on down the road. I wanted to share this number because it perfectly sets up the severity and really the insidious, lingering nature of the radioactive fallout we are about to look at next. So the crucial point is that this lingering fallout didn't just affect humans, it caused literal generational trauma in nature. Just months after the Fukushima explosion, scientists found large numbers of deeply mutated butterflies. They had been exposed to radioactive substances while still in their highly vulnerable larval and cocoon stages. Because the exposure was constant, it caused this really slow DNA damage that completely disrupted their metamorphosis. They developed shrunken wings, folded wings, severe uneven growth patterns, and even holes. But here is the truly terrifying reality of Fukushima. Some of these butterflies actually pass these exact physical mutations down to the next generation. The effects of human-made radiation didn't just impact a single insect, it permanently altered its offspring. Now, this kind of genetic alteration also showed up after Chernobyl, but in a very different way, a complete lack of color. In nature, most cases of inherited albinism are just a natural genetic variation, where pigment distribution is passed down genetically from both parents. But with radiation-induced albinism, nuclear radiation physically destroys the cells responsible for producing melanin altogether. It's not a genetic roll of the dice. It alters the fundamental colors of local wildlife by literally destroying the biological machinery that creates the pigment in the first place. A prime example of this was found in the barn swallows living around Chernobyl. Because the radiation severely damaged their melanin-producing cells, these birds failed to develop any normal pigmentation in their feathers. Now, interestingly enough, this mutation didn't immediately make the birds sick, but think about the practical ecological consequences here. A bright white bird flying around in a dark forest is incredibly visible. This dramatic lack of color made them walking or flying targets for predators. On top of that, studies found these pigment-mutated birds were way more likely to experience reproductive problems. So ultimately, this radiation-induced color change drastically shortened their lifespans in the wild. Finally, Section 5, the toxic plant imposter. Time for a plot twist. Take a look at this bizarre piece of history. Back in the late 1950s, farmers across the United States were absolutely shocked. Their sheep were giving birth to lambs with severely abnormal faces. And the most striking feature?
They had a single, fused eye right in the center of their face, looking exactly like the monstrous Cyclops from Greek mythology. Now, given the era, this was the height of the Cold War and atomic testing, farmers and scientists immediately, and understandably, suspected that radioactive fallout or some harsh chemical exposure was to blame for these monstrous births.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the actual culprit wasn't a nuclear bomb at all. It was something called cyclopamine. Scientists eventually discovered that cyclopamine is a substance naturally found in certain poisonous plants. If ingested, this highly potent chemical completely disrupts the development of an embryo's brain during its absolute earliest stages. So the true culprit of this horrifying mutation wasn't human-made radiation. It was simply a natural dietary plant toxin that the mother sheep just happened to eat while grazing in the field. Let's clearly lay out the biological steps here, because this ties right back into our overarching theme of embryonic disruption. First, the mother sheep ingested these poisonous plants during pregnancy. The cyclopamine entered her system and made its way to the embryo. Because of this toxin, the embryos have literally failed to divide into two normal sides. The biological process that is supposed to naturally separate the eyes simply did not occur, causing them to completely fuse in the center. Sadly, these cyclops lambs died very quickly after birth because their brain and respiratory organs were also fundamentally malformed by the plant toxin. Which brings us to a pretty sobering realization. The Cyclops sheep prove that while human-made radiation from disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima is undeniably devastating, nature holds its own terrifying, entirely non-radioactive mutagens. This perfectly brings our whole myth versus reality arc to a close today. Whether it's a damaged nuclear reactor disrupting a frog's DNA, or just a quiet, poisonous plant scrambling a lamb's embryonic development, the delicate blueprint of life is just incredibly vulnerable to the environment around it. We've seen frogs with extra limbs, rats with overgrown jaws, insects dealing with generational trauma, and spiders that seemingly lose their minds. The evidence of how environmental disruptors break the biological rules is completely undeniable at this point, but as we reflect on the sheer scale of the genetic chaos we've explored today, it leaves us with one final, incredibly chilling question to ponder. What would happen to humans if they were exposed directly to the exact same radioactive substances? Honestly, just think about that for a second. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.